She says that the sweet, kind-hearted, compassionate Diane is just part of a much more complicated whole. And because she was so riddled with insecurities and inadequacies, it made her a very mercurial person to deal with. Quite frankly, one never really knew where one stood with her, or how she was going to react. Unlike Charles, who, though extremely up and down in terms of his temper tantrums, was generally straight and fair with his employees. However, when he did want changes made, nothing could dissuade him, and he could be extremely intransigent and ruthless. As long as he got his own way, everything ran smoothly, but nobody could honestly say that he is an easy man to live with. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and today we're going to be doing a new book because I'm just over Omid Scobie. It's too boring. It's not interesting. That he's not saying anything new. He's not bringing anything to the table. I just found myself dreading reading it and dreading prepping for it, and just judging by the numbers, I mean, y'all are tuning in, but you're not loving it. And so I just was like, who am I doing this for? I have a really bad tendency to feel like if I start a book, I have to finish it. And I mean, I say it's a bad tendency. I think it's generally a good way to approach life, finish what you start. But with something like this, where like we're here for entertainment, this shouldn't feel like a slog session. And so we're done with it. So then I was like, well, that's fine, because my new book, Ask Not, The Kennedys and the Women That They Destroyed, was supposed to come yesterday. Amazon failed me epically. I pre-ordered it. It was supposed to come. Well, I'd been waiting and waiting. I was standing at the door like all day long, like, when is the mailman coming? He came and went and brought some other stuff for my husband. Where was my stuff? So I look at my app. Oh yeah, that's not going to come till July 28th. What? You guys, that completely destroyed my plan. Luckily, I had another book that had come, and I was planning on doing this later after we had done Ask Not and then the Beckhams, because I was kind of like, well, do we want a little break from the Royals just for like a hot second to talk about some other very interesting books that have huge buzz around both of them. But since both of them aren't coming until way later, I decided to just go ahead and do this. This is called The Housekeeper's Diary. This was an absolute page turner. Now, I'm not done with it yet, but I sat down last night and like started reading it. I was like, well, I got to do something tomorrow. You know, we got to have a new episode tomorrow. And it was like the exact opposite of my experience reading Omid Scobie's Endgame. I couldn't put it down. I was like, it's getting really late. I need to go to bed because I got to be up at 4. And I could not put it down. I like had to fight myself to put the book down and go to bed. This is going to be so good. It's also not, my pen's in the book, so you can't tell how thick it really is, but it's not even a thick book. So it's not like it's going to take us forever to get through this, but every chapter is so juicy. And let me tell you why, because it's a primary source, right? Now, when I was doing earlier this year, many of you followed along with the Diana book that I was reading earlier this year by Lady Colin Campbell, and that did not end well. For those of you who were following along with that saga, she didn't appreciate that I was covering the book, and she felt that because I questioned a certain scene in the book, after viewing some video footage that she had referenced, and I didn't see the same thing, she was very upset at me. And so I took down all of the videos covering her book. It wasn't fair that I was making content off of her book. So I was like, that's fine. I'll just move on. But a lot of people, when I was doing that review, said you should really look at The Housekeeper's Diary because that's a primary source. It's somebody who really interacted with Diana on a daily basis. You know, she's talking with all the staff. Her son actually was the valet for Prince Edward and Prince Andrew. She was all in it. And she saw firsthand what it was really like. Now, this book, of course, is banned in Britain because in England, you cannot write about the royal family. And it's illegal. Like, you can't work for them and then use that to make money later. So this was published in America and only in America. So some of my British friends have had trouble getting a hold of this book, although I think it's possible. I mean, anything's possible. But I can see why it was banned. Now, one of the other things I really like about this book is I think she's pretty fair. Like, she's not taking sides at all. Like, she has things to say about both Charles and Diana. And I also think that she was divorced herself and had 4 young boys that she was trying to provide for. And I think that having had the experience of divorce, she brings to the table a lot of compassion for the situation that they were both in. So I just think she's a very interesting voice for this. And I just think that she's very fair. And so I think that I can't wait to read this book for those of you who haven't read it. And then for those of you who are with Shauna while she was doing it, you all know what a great book this is. So hopefully you'll stay tuned for my interpretation of what we're about to read. Let's go ahead and get started because I do want to cover, I'd love to cover more than one chapter, but you know how I do. Sometimes that's not possible. Wendy Berry begins her book by telling how she came to the position of housekeeper at Highgrove. Now, this book is based off of diaries that she kept during her entire time there. She says in this first chapter that when she came to Highgrove, the buzz was this sort of scandalous old story that had happened. And she says that when she got there, everybody was telling her about this time where it was about 10:30 at night and Prince Charles and Princess Diana were lying unusually for them in the same bed in their elegant country home. Within minutes, Diana had pulled off her long white t-shirt. Their kisses grew more intimate. Both giggled. In the throes of passion, Princess Diana, with her foot, knocked over a framed photograph of Althorpe, her family home, on the bedside table. Diana stretched out her long legs, one foot now resting on the small wooden table. Suddenly, the door flew open, and 2 police detectives, guns drawn, burst in. "What the bloody hell do you think you're doing?" shouted Charles as he struggled to pull the sheets over himself and his wife. "Get out of here at once!" As the embarrassed policeman made a quick retreat, the prince grabbed a thick, dark blue toweling robe bearing his crest and followed them out on the first-floor landing at Highgrove. In low, apologetic tones, the detectives pointed out what had happened. Their explanation was met with a roar of laughter from the prince. Shortly after knocking over the photograph, Diana's foot had pressed one of the emergency buttons that are installed just a few inches away from every royal bed. She would not have realized what she had done, for the alarm doesn't sound in the room itself, only in the police post to the side of the house. On hearing it, the detectives had immediately gone into emergency procedure. 2 had raced towards the bedroom, while the others radioed out for reinforcements. The heir to the throne was in danger. This story, in all its hilarious detail, was recounted to me shortly after I started work as housekeeper at Highgrove in November 1985. The entire episode was hushed up, of course, to avoid any publicity, but it was a topic of conversation for many months. Highgrove's security was necessarily extremely tight. There were panic buttons in every room, and sometimes more than one. In fact, in the early days, staff often pressed them by mistake when they were dusting and cleaning. They're rather cumbersome in shape. They're solid, flat squares of gold-colored metal with a little red button in the center. The alarms certainly do their job. The squad is trained for moments like this, so within seconds, Charles and Diana were surrounded. Even though it was nighttime, there were apparently some very red faces. After all, it's not everyone who catches a naked Prince Charles on top of the princess in the middle of making love. Although the, quote, love alert went into the annals of Highgrove staff legend, during my time as housekeeper, I was never to see or even hear of such intimacy again. At least not between the prince and princess. So that sort of sets the tone of the story. Like, the reason she tells us this story isn't just to be a scandal maker, but because that was at the beginning, and things are certainly going to change by the end of this book. But she's got to lay the groundwork for the fact that there was a time when they were quite intimate with each other and enjoyed each other in that way. Now, she says that during her time there, it's important for you to know that she saw both parents be very good parents to William and Harry. Of course, the media always said that Diana was the warm parent, Charles was the cold. But she wants to let you know that in her experience, that was not the case. She says both were devoted to their young family, William and Harry, and like any couple, they had their ups and downs. But apart from the occasional flare-ups, they were substantially contented together when I first started in the winter of 1985, despite the occasional tears and scenes from the princess. These outbursts were a sad foretaste of the marital agony the prince and princess, and by association their staff, were to live through over the next 8 years. I'd been through my own domestic problems, divorced and left to raise 4 boys, but I still used to wonder what had gone so wrong between the prince and his wife. Slowly over the years, we began to realize that the marriage was under pressure and that the prince was presuming his bachelor lifestyle. But right up until the early 1990s, it seemed inconceivable that they could separate or divorce. So the only alternative was for them to swallow some pride and try to work their way through their difficulties as best they could. At least that was what most of us thought. Both had individual, fully absorbing activities at Highgrove in the early years. Charles his garden, and Diana the young boys. There did exist a certain tension between them, and it was quite obvious that at times they simply did not get on. But generally, the prince and princess would sustain civility towards each other, Diana referring to Charles as my hubby, and the prince always calling her darling. Both tried hard to be polite, especially in front of their guests. But in later years, even that was not always guaranteed. Diana was incapable of hiding her true feelings for very long, and could be positively beastly to her personal staff. Tears were not just reserved for her either when things got a bit too much. She had a reputation for bringing about resignations by freezing people out of her circle, and was capable of making the lives of her personal staff a misery. She wants you to know that Diana was not just this angelic creature who had never done a thing wrong and had never put a step out. She says that the sweet, kind-hearted, compassionate Diana is just part of a much more complicated whole. The part the public do not see is sometimes far removed from the princess act, and none too pleasant. And because she was so riddled with insecurities and inadequacies, it made her a very mercurial person to deal with. Quite frankly, one never really knew where one stood with her, or how she was going to react. Unlike Charles, who, though extremely up and down in terms of his temper tantrums, was generally straight and fair with his employees. However, when he did want changes made, nothing could dissuade him, and he could be extremely intransigent and ruthless. As long as he got his own way, everything ran smoothly, but nobody could honestly say that he is an easy man to live with. That paragraph right there is very illuminating. Because, well, I think that many of us have come to realize that the picture of Diana as being this perfect little princess isn't really true. And how could it be? I mean, that's not an honest representation of anybody. Nobody is perfect all the time. So it was a little bit sugary for the press to try to persuade us that she was just this woman of no faults who was continually sinned against by the royal family. So, I mean, I think anybody who's honest with themselves knew that wasn't quite right. But I do think that, at least this is news to me, that Charles can be difficult and can have this sort of entitled sense. I don't know why that would surprise me. I mean, he is a prince who's the heir to the throne. So, of course, people have probably generally given him his own way his whole life. So, I guess I don't know that I would say surprised. I guess it was just a side of his personality I haven't thought that much about. She said that naturally they were all drilled. Like, there's no gossip about Charles and Diana. What you hear stays here. Don't say anything. And she said that they all became used to sort of dismissing the rows and the scenes as part of any royal marriage. You know, that just must be how they all do. But, she says, unhappiness tends to breed unhappiness, and the couple's problems were capable of poisoning the atmosphere of the whole house. Everything was fine as long as the staff put on a united front. In fact, the camaraderie in the face of adversity created a strong bond between us, trauma bonding, and it was only challenged later when staff were impelled to support either the prince or the princess. It's almost like divorced children who have really childish parents were like, pick either me or daddy, you know. The first question for anyone who came on duty in the morning would be, what mood are they in? Depending on what the valet or the dresser said, you could know whether we were in for a peaceful time or for, as former Highgrove butler Paul Burrell would dub them, storm stations. Now, she had some foreknowledge about what this job would be like because her son James went to go work for the royal family first. She says, James and his friends, who had worked for the household at Buckingham and Kensington Palaces before me, told me what to expect. They all knew about Diana's eating problems, her terrible insecurities, and her mood swings. They also knew how difficult and bloody-minded Charles could be when he didn't get his own way. But I dismissed the scare stories as simple exaggeration, because everybody seemed to thrive on the excitement of the royal service. I entered in as an innocent and decided that until I had actually seen what it was like on the inside, I would refrain from making judgments. So what exactly was James' experience? She says she remembers James telling her about his initiation into the royal household. So he had arrived at Aberdeen Station in late 1982, and he'd been apprehensive because he was going to be a footman, so he wasn't quite sure how that was all going to work or how they would sort of throw him in. And he was supposed to be looking after Queen, Prince Philip, and the rest of the royal family at Balmoral for 6 weeks. But he was the new boy, so they broke him in easily. Says that dinner that first evening was an informal affair. And James goes on the record as saying, it was my first glimpse of the royal family at home, and to be quite frank, my initial reaction was total shock. That first sight of the royals sitting down at table chatting about commonplace things, such as the day's walking and riding, was unremarkable, of course. What was remarkable was the number of staff. The footman, butler, queen's page, cooks, pastry chefs, and cellar staff all waiting on their every whim. James continued, I remember thinking at the time that it was that scene which stirred some hitherto unrecognized Republican thoughts in my brain. It would not be too strong to say I was flabbergasted by all the staff required for just 4 people. The pastry chefs were on hand, for example, because one of the group had mentioned they wanted some bread and butter pudding for dessert. All the kitchen and staff naturally stayed on duty to make sure this was produced at the right time at exactly the right temperature. It was an eye-opener, and there was one maxim that I would never forget. 4 staff can always do a job better than 1. Maybe that's what Charles meant when he became king and said he wanted to kind of like strip down some of this foolishness. I mean, do you really need that many people waiting on you? I know you're king and queen and all, and it is socially acceptable. But this footman, I mean, I agree. That to me would have been a little bit of a startling reality when there's 4 people here and there are countless staff just sort of waiting in the wings to rush in at your every whim and wish. That would have seemed a little bit excessive. Wendy takes a little bit of a turn here to talk about her background and how she ended up becoming the housekeeper at Highgrove. She says that in the autumn of 1985, she was in need of a job that would provide for her 4 children, and she needed a little bit more financial security. She writes that in 1979, her marriage had fallen apart, so she'd gone back to college, passing 6.0 and 2 A levels in 2 years. After a 3-year course at St. Catherine's College, part of Liverpool University, she says she graduated with a BA in English, and by 1981, she was teaching A-level English part-time, as well as English as a foreign language to businessmen when she could fit it in. They lived in Liverpool in a comfortable house, but she says that they were constantly financially stretched, and she just needed something that was more stable and secure. So when James, who had already gone to go work for the royal family, mentioned they were in need of a housekeeper, she jumped on the job. James had worked at the palace as a footman and then as a valet for both Prince Andrew and Edward. When he moved over to Kensington Palace, he was in regular contact with Princess Diana. He had first met her at Balmoral when he pulled off a social coup that was to stun many of his fellow footmen. So one night there was a ball, and James and many of the other staff were still in livery after coming straight in on the ball from their duties. So it was a James Barry in uniform whom Diana confronted as the music started. One minute I was chatting with one of the footmen, the next minute this clearing had opened up in front of me like some biblical parting of the sea, he laughed. There in front of me was a very pale, slim, beautiful Princess of Wales dressed in a long white ball gown. "You're James, the new footman, aren't you?" said Diana quietly. "Would you like to dance?" I put my drink down and rather self-consciously took her hand. The other men I had been drinking with looked on in amazement. Everyone secretly hopes and half dreads they'll be asked, but I think some were a bit put out that after years it had still not happened to them. The first dance was dreadful on my part. I can't remember the number of times I'd trod on her toes or spun her the wrong way. It was with relief that I heard the music come to an end, but just as I was about to suggest walking off the floor, she joked, "Not so soon, James. One more, if you please." We both laughed and relaxed after that. We didn't talk on that occasion, but there was some rapport. We were close in age, and over the years I was to become, like several others of her staff, increasingly drawn into her confidence. One afternoon in early September 1985, Diana and James were having a chat on the first floor corridor of Kensington Palace. James, then under butler to Harold Brown, had taken some tea through to her sitting room. Diana was describing the latest Simply Brilliant Andrew Lloyd Webber show when she mentioned that she and the prince were looking for a housekeeper at Highgrove. "It's very difficult, James, because we can't advertise, but I thought you might know somebody," she said. James said that he would ask around. Jobs like these are usually found by word of mouth. Before she added with a dismissive laugh, "I can honestly say that I don't envy anyone the position. It's constantly raining there, and Highgrove can be such a chore. The thing is, the children enjoy it, and I go because of them. It is important they can have somewhere like that to go on weekends." Just as she was turning to go, James mentioned my name. Princess Diana was familiar with Wendy Barry because she'd come and spend a week with her son when they were in Balmoral in 1983. And she said, "Are you sure your mother would be interested, James?" She cocked her head to one side. "If she really is, you tell her to write Lieutenant Colonel Creasy and fix up an interview." 4 days after sending my letter to Colonel Creasy, the comptroller of the household, I was invited to London for an interview on Monday, October 14th. She says that she was a little bit flustered at the interview because her train was delayed by 30 minutes, so she was late by 20 minutes. And so she walked in just feeling flustered and like, maybe I shouldn't even go into this interview because I look ridiculous. I'm 20 minutes late for this. And then her agitation at herself was increased by fear because she went in and she thought they were trying to play a trick on her. And Colonel Creasy is described as an extremely urbane soldier who offered her a cigarette. And she says that she hesitated at first because she knew this was a non-smoking household. So was this a trick to see if she would immediately break a rule that she already knew? But then he was very kind and he said, "Don't worry, Mrs. Barry. It's not a test. I smoke as well." So he goes through her CV with her and he says, "Quite frankly, you're overqualified for this job. But the princess has already told me that if you want it, it's your job. And she'd like to meet you. So after I'm done talking to you, I'll take you up to her and you get to meet Princess Diana." Amazed at the informality of the interview, I was shown down to the palace courtyard where I was met by the prince's chauffeur, Tim Williams, in a maroon Scorpio car. He whisked me over to Kensington Palace and dropped me at the side door. She says that she was met by Harold Brown, the butler at Kensington Palace, and she writes, I don't know how I had expected a butler to speak, but I was rather surprised and impressed by the informality of this pale-faced and obviously terribly efficient man. I was later to hear that Harold, who was said to be a member of the strict Plymouth Brethren sect, could turn his hand to most things, whether making curtains or knocking out a set of shelves for the servants' quarters. Unlike several rather bumptious and pretentious footmen with ridiculous airs and graces, Harold was straightforward and very reassuring. So he's leading her all through Highgrove, all through the back passages, and she says that I was struck at how all the staff areas resembled the rooms of a rather dilapidated public school. There was a small flight of stairs that led up to the first-floor kitchen. A faint smell of toast and milk hung in the air. Standing on the stairs in the royal part of the house, waiting to see the princess, I was gripped once again by a terrible attack of nerves. Would she like me? What would she say? Would I be able to speak sensibly? It was, after all, the first time I had met her. Don't be nervous. She really is very sweet, said Harold, squeezing my arm as he went to announce my arrival. And remember, call her your Royal Highness first of all, and then ma'am, to rhyme with spam, after that. I was ushered into her sitting room and saw her standing by the fireplace, lined with invitations and family photographs. The door shut behind me. Now you must be Wendy, she smiled as she reached out her hand. I've heard so much about you from James. Come and sit down. Standing in front of me was the most stunning-looking woman in her early 20s. She was wearing a simple summer dress and looked at me with a moment with large, deep blue smiling eyes. Her skin was perfect, her poise exquisite, the whole effect quite breathtaking. Yet there was something about her, something that none of the many thousands of pictures taken of her ever really captured. It was her weight. She looked so much thinner than I had expected. As she turned and beckoned me to a chair, I noticed how painfully fragile her back looked, her shoulder blades visibly poking through her silk dress. Now, I'm so glad that you want to work for us at Highgrove. But first, there are several things you must know before you start, if you are still sure you want to. One thing you must realize is extremely wet up there. In fact, it seems to rain all the time. Do you think you can cope with that? It's a wonderful place for the boys and my husband with all its outdoor things, but I'm afraid not really my cup of tea. If you're into country pursuits, however, you'll love it. Diana explained in broad outlines what my duties would include. We always have lots of log fires, so I'm afraid these need to be cleaned every day. And there's quite a lot of entertaining and general day-to-day household administration, including preparing the guest rooms, which I'm sure you're more than capable of. The lodge at the end of the drive will be yours, of course, and since it's by the main road, you might want to have it double glazed. Apart from that, the damp, you might quite like it. I do think, however, that you should go up there with Colonel Creasy to have a look round before you finally make up your mind. The interview lasted just a quarter of an hour, and I was struck by how beautiful and natural she was. I was charmed and made to feel comfortable. It was my first taste of Diana's charm, a formidable and potent force, and a force that she would use in the future with devastating effect. I think it's so interesting, just the part about her being so thin in real life, because, you know, you do see pictures of her looking quite frail, especially around this time, before she'd sort of regained her health later in the 90s, when so many of her pictures post-marriage show somebody who's quite healthy. But I can think of a few pictures I saw of her where she did look really tiny. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that I ever really thought she looked as though she suffered from an eating disorder. And so I think that's interesting that Wendy would point out that you never actually saw in pictures how frail she was until you saw her in real life. Well, she goes on to say that she did go up to Highgrove to see what the house was like. She goes with Colonel Creasy and Tim Williams, the chauffeur, and they drive her up there, and they stop for lunch on the way. And it was her first initiation into the hierarchy of the staff of the royal family. She says, Colonel and Tim Williams were waiting for me in the Scorpio. All right, asked the comptroller cheerily. We'll head off to Highgrove now and stop for a bite of lunch on the way. We pulled in at a motorway service area. The comptroller paid for everything and sat with me at one of the smoking tables. Tim Williams sat elsewhere. That apparently was the normal way of doing things in the palace pecking order. As comptroller, Colonel Creasy was an important man in the household. As a housekeeper designate, I appeared to be at a higher level than a chauffeur. None of these things is ever written down. They're just known and understood. Newcomers, therefore, are faced with a veritable minefield of potential gaffes until they start to pick up the workings of the hierarchy. Working for the royals, perhaps the most class-ridden organization in the world, generates a similar class system among those in their service. In this way, Prince Charles Valet will always be deemed more important and powerful than his counterpart who works for Prince Andrew, the nanny to Prince William more revered than the nanny to Princess Beatrice. So they pull up to Highgrove, and she takes this opportunity to give you a little history about the home. She says that it was bought in 1980 for over $750,000 from the conservative MP Maurice McMillan. Highgrove House was and continues to be Prince Charles' pride and joy. Set when he bought it in 347 acres of prime land, Highgrove is less than 8 miles from Princess Anne's house, and not far from Badminton. Its extensive parkland also lies within the Duke of Beaufort's hunt, a particular factor, when Charles asked the Duchy of Cornwall to look into acquiring it. Originally built between 1796 and 1798, the house was heavily restored in the late 19th century after being destroyed by fire. An easy 120-mile journey from Buckingham Palace, it lay a mere 17 miles from the home, at that time, of Camilla and Andrew Parker Bowles at Allington, near Chippenham. Now, when we read Lady C's book, she said that Camilla's proximity to the house had nothing to do with why he bought it. And she really downplays the attraction between the two of them for some time until Diana leapt out showing she had no interest in a marriage of fidelity. And then that was when Charles decided to sort of meander back into his bachelor lifestyle. That's not necessarily the description that we get from Wendy. And as we go along, you're going to see that Wendy does not play into a lot of the gossip that surrounded Diana and some of the talk that Lady C promoted in her book, particularly the relationship between Barry Manickey, Diana's detective, and Diana. So she's not just regurgitating every little bit of gossip you've ever heard and giving it more color. And she's not pushing the Camilla narrative here, as you'll see in a minute. But she certainly goes to some length to shut down the idea that Diana and Barry had something going on. All right, the book goes on to say that Camilla was a regular visitor to Highgrove before and throughout Prince's marriage to Diana. In the early days, she had even lent the prince her regular cook when he stayed at his country house. Highgrove's proximity to Allington was not lost on Diana, who just weeks after their engagement tried to persuade Charles to look for another country home. Her entreaties, however, fell on deaf ears, and even caused anger when the subject was raised again, for the prince was livid that anyone should question his motives or his movements as far as Highgrove was concerned. If you know that you aren't in the wrong and your motives are completely pure, you have no reason to be angry at somebody for saying, "Why are we living so close to your former girlfriend?" And if it was all above board, you could just calmly say all the reasons why you bought it and just say, it just happens that it's close. But, it's not like England's a huge, huge country. I'm sure that most of the elites live in some proximity to each other. It's not like America, where she could really have some questions about why he was living there. There's only so much land. Okay, anyway, back to the story. She says that her first impressions were that Highgrove had had a lot of money spent on it and the rooms were immaculate. The comptroller, Nesta Whiteland, then the housekeeper, who was suffering from lung cancer, followed us through and sat and chatted in the staff dining room. I looked at the drab beige walls there, badly in need of a paint job, and cast my eyes over the wicker chairs and tables that had come from Diana's flat, where she had lived before her marriage. This is the second time she's mentioned that the staff areas were never kept in any kind of pristine condition, whereas where the royals were, everything was kept immaculately and lots of money was spent. But whatever you could throw in the staff direction, and you don't need to take care of the rooms they're in, you don't need to make them nice or anything. It's just like, they just work for you. It's not a big deal. She goes to some detail to describe the kitchen and how nice everything was there. And then she says that they were led on through to the royal residence. And she said she couldn't believe the state of Charles' study. There were piles of loose papers scattered all over the floor, open books laying on chairs, and heaps of magazines that lay dotted around like islands in some enormous ocean. And Charles wasn't there. He wasn't staying at the house. This was really his weekend home. So she was sort of wondering why it wasn't picked up. But the former housekeeper, Nesta Whiteland, told her, don't move anything around in here. If a pen's on the floor, hoover around it. For us Americans, that would mean to vacuum. There were many times later on, says Wendy, when I used to split my skirt as I tried to step over the piles of books and papers. So then they climbed the stairs to the first floor. And she says, I was told that only I, the valet, and the dresser would have access to the prince's and princess's rooms. The butlers were under orders not to enter the royal rooms, which were the valet's territory, and jealously guarded. My look of surprise that the prince and princess had separate rooms led to a mysterious answer. Yes, that's right. You'll see what's going on, they told her. I let the matter drop, but just popped my head inside the two rooms, devoid of the personal belongings that travel with Charles and Diana wherever they're staying. The rooms need to be kept in a perpetual state of readiness in case one of them decides to graciously drop in at the last moment, Joan added with heavy sarcasm. Now, listen to the description of Diana's room, which I found oddly childish. The book says that Diana's room had a big sofa filled with cuddly toys, including large koala bears, a felt frog, a couple of giant penguins, teddy bears, and a wombat. We walked through to her bathroom, which had fitted cupboards and a kidney-shaped table with photographs under its glass top. Another chest of drawers was covered with yet more ornaments collected on her travels. Any surface will be completely covered with her bits and pieces, warned Joan. She likes all her knickknacks around her. My eye was caught by all the photographs of Diana and her family in quite standard leather, wood, and china frames. Why, as a grown adult, would you have a couch full of stuffed animals? I don't get that. Why would I want that? Why would I want that clutter? But it seems like she sort of liked to collect clutter. Maybe there was a sense of like feeling safe, being surrounded by all your little knickknacks. Almost like a hoarder. Not that she was like to the level of like people living in houses with dead animals because the collection of debris has become so high they can't find the dead animal, but just, what do you need all this junk for? Anyway, then they took her to the nursery where she could see around there, said that Harry's cot was still up and ready for use. And she was told, that she'd need to come in here and help out with the nanny's bed, William's bed, make those up, make sure that the guest rooms were always ready. And we're introduced to Barbara Barnes, who was the boy's nanny at the time. Shortly before I left to have a look at the lodge, I was introduced to Nesta's husband, Paddy Whiteland, who was Charles's groom and general factotum. He shoveled into the kitchen in old cords, stinking of horses, and held out a very grimy hand. I liked him immediately, but could already tell there was a roguish side to his personality. Over the next few years, I learned a lot about Paddy and his special relationship with the prince, the secrets, and the trust between them. Now, down at the lodge, she was to receive a surprise, because up until this point, she's seen nothing but sort of clunky places for the staff to exist, in all those sort of back-of-the-way hallways and staff sitting rooms and whatnot. But down at the lodge, built in 1798, I was amazed to see a top-of-the-range fitted kitchen in what was, after all, only staff quarters. If anything, it had better units than those in the main house. Wedding presents, laughed Colonel Creasy. In the end, we had so many of the ready things we didn't know where to put them. There's one in the valet's cottage as well. On the way back to London, I told the Colonel I would take the job. Magnificent, he exclaimed. I hoped you would. Incidentally, the pay is $5,600 a year, and you'll need your own car, and you can start on November 1st. So that's the first chapter, but let's go ahead and get into the second, because we have time. So in chapter 2, what she's doing here is sort of laying out the pattern and routine for the weekends that she would experience when Prince Charles and Diana would come. They came most weekends, and usually they would come on Friday night, and then the boys and Diana would leave by Sunday after lunch. Charles would usually stay through Sunday night and then go to whatever Monday engagements he had the next day. But this chapter begins with the first time that the family came to Highgrove. So it was a little bit alarming because they pull up in this whole convoy of cars, and Charles gets out and says, "Hello there, you must be Wendy. Would you mind getting a bucket and sponge ready? Harry's been sick in the car." It was my first weekend at Highgrove, and even though I had Joan and Mrs. Patty, as Nesta was always called, to help me, I still was feeling quite nervous. "Oh, dear, your Royal Highness," I said, fortunately remembering to use the correct greeting. "I'll go and find one." I looked outside, and I saw other cars pulling up in the back courtyard. "I simply don't know what's wrong with the boy. He keeps on being ill whenever he goes on long car journeys. At least this time it didn't happen in my car, and all over my papers. It quite ruined the notes I was making for a speech." He chuckled as he remembered the incident, then pointed through the window and said, "Oh, here they are, action stations." Quickly filling the bucket, I followed the prince out to the red stretch limo containing Diana, the nanny, and the boys. Dressed in black leggings and a jumper, Diana laughed as she handed Harry over to the nanny. "Do you mind taking him a moment, Barbara? I've got sick all over me." A thoroughly fed-up Harry was deposited into Barbara's arms and rushed off to the nursery for a change. Meanwhile, William, now a large 3-year-old, had jumped out of the other door and was running to greet his father. The prince scooped him up into his arms and whirled William, by now squealing with delight, round the air. So there's quite a bit of staff present, even just for this little family get-together. This is not like a big weekend. It's just the 4 of them, the 2 children, the 2 adults. But we have Faye Marshalsea, the dresser on duty, who had arrived earlier that day. Then, of course, Charles' valet, Ken. And her son, James, had come as well. The chef, Mervyn Wycherley. And the back courtyard, she says, was beginning to resemble a hotel car park. With no guests expected, I had been told it was going to be a quiet weekend, despite the fact that more than 10 staff, including policemen, were accompanying them. That evening, the prince and princess decided that they were going to have their meal together on the card table in the sitting room. It was ordered for 8 p.m. and had been prepared by Mervyn earlier that day. The vegetables, nearly always picked from the Highgrove garden, were trimmed and left in cold salted water ready to be microwaved at the last minute. Shortly before 7 p.m., all the traveling staff and I met for a quick gin on the first floor staff sitting room overlooking the back garden. Then we sat down to our own private dining room and had dinner. Our supper finished, it was time for Mervyn to start cooking Charles and Diana's meal. Since they had decided to eat as usual in the sitting room, it would be taken in by James on a tray. As they had their early evening bath, James laid the square card table with a white linen cloth and made sure that the fire was burning properly and emptied the wastepaper baskets. Dressed in corduroy shirt and sweater, Charles came down to the sitting room alone. James came back to the kitchen to tell Mervyn that Diana had decided not to have the chicken, but would like just a salad instead. Mervyn shrugged his shoulders and muttered, "Please herself. Sounds like it's going to be one of those weekends." Meanwhile, James went to the large fridge and took out a small Schwab's bottle that had been filled with a gin martini cocktail. "The prince wants his martini now and dinner in 20 minutes. Is that all right, Merv?" he said, before pouring the contents into a small crystal tumbler. 20 minutes later, Diana popped her head round the kitchen door. "I do hope I haven't put you out, Mervyn," she said quietly. "I just really didn't feel like the chicken this evening." She looked subdued. "That's quite all right, ma'am," lied Mervyn. "I'll do you a nice salad." Then turning to me, she said, "I do hope everyone's looking after you, Wendy. It can be a bit daunting at first, can't it?" She's always being very sweet when she first meets a person. It's like, to draw someone in and say it's very difficult, it's also to admit that she's having difficulties as well, and that she is somebody that you can rely on to understand your plight, hoping that perhaps you'll understand her plight as well and give her a wide berth when she decides to have an attitude. By 9:25 p.m., Diana went upstairs to her room, and Charles stayed reading in the sitting room until well past 11 p.m. But as soon as the princess had gone up, I went to the staff sitting room and had a quick drink with Barbara and the rest of the traveling staff. It was all quite surreal. Nobody gossiped openly about the prince and princess, although certain knowing looks were exchanged. She says that she was supposed to start the next day at 7 a.m., and she was told that under no circumstance should she be making any noise that would wake anybody up, so she needed to go about her tasks quietly. So she decided that, as she was expected to do all the vacuuming in the house, she would just use the manual sweeper for the carpets so that she wouldn't wake anybody up. By 7:20 the next day, she had done most of the downstairs dusting and laid the fires. She walked into the kitchen and she found Ken proudly making the prince's Earl Grey tea, saying, he always got it to him right on the dot. He never messed up. She says I waited downstairs as Ken went up to the prince's room with a china cup and saucer on a tray. Charles had quite a sweet tooth, but tried to avoid sugar, so Ken always put a spoonful of honey in the tea instead. At the same time, Faye walked into Diana's adjoining bedroom and woke her up. Within a few minutes, there was a dreadful sound of grunting and moaning, followed by rhythmic thumping. Charles was doing his daily chin-ups on a bronze bar fitted above his bathroom door. In the months and years to come, I could always tell when he was up, by the sound of the radio, usually Radio 4, and the bumping sound of his exercises. Chin-ups were not the only thing the prince did first thing in the morning, before his first bath of the day. Sometimes he went through a phase of sit-ups as well. For these, he would get Ken or Michael, his relief valet, to sit on his ankles on the exercise bed in the guest blue room as he struggled, in just a pair of white boxer shorts, to do his daily 40 trunk curls. Unfortunately, I never witnessed a sight of Ken, somewhat embarrassed, dressed smartly in his blue blazer and flannels, sitting on Charles's feet as he put his body through its strenuous exercise routine. One thing I noticed as I was reading this is, it's interesting how fastidious they are about their routine and sticking to things like, I need my Earl Grey at this time, and then I'm going to do my sit-ups at this time, etc., etc. And possibly Diane is less fastidious about her routine. But when it comes to the bit where she talks about cleaning up their rooms, they're quite messy people. And I suppose, why would you learn to be neat when you never had to be? Because someone's going to pick it up after you, so why should you pick it up? But, almost to the point of, potentially slovenly. Wendy goes on to say that first morning, Diana took an early bath and came down casually dressed just before 8:30. She found Wendy in the sitting room with the manual sweeper. "Oh, Wendy, what on earth are you doing that for?" she said as she walked in. I explained I didn't want to wake everybody up. "Well, why don't you leave all the hoovering until well after 8 and do the other things beforehand?" she said. "The prince and I certainly don't mind the noise as long as we're up. If you carry on using that old contraption, it'll take you hours to go over the whole house." With that, she walked into the dining room where a buffet of chopped fruit, cereal, and linseed had been laid out on the side dresser the night before. The large mahogany table was covered for breakfast with a big plastic wipe-down tablecloth. How unfortunate. Places were set at one end, and the prince at the head, and Diana to his left, half a pink grapefruit and a couple of pots of yogurt on her mat. At the far end of the table was a selection of the morning papers, the Times for the prince, and the Mail Express and her favorite new paper, Today, for the princess. On Sundays, Charles would take the Sunday Times, with Diana opting for the Mail on Sunday and Sunday Express. Well, what were the boys up to? Well, they were, taking their sweet time to get downstairs to eat the breakfast that had been laid out for them. Barbara Barnes usually prepared the boys and her own breakfast from a tray they'd been taking up the night before, allowing Charles and Diana to have a few hours alone together. But this didn't always work, as William would sometimes toddle down to Diana's room and climb into bed with her after going for his early morning cuddle with Barbara in her bed. Although Barbara, an attractive slim woman with light brown hair, could be quite formal with the rest of the staff, she had a real bond with the boys, especially William. She was an old-fashioned nanny in the sense that her prime concern, although she would never admit it, was the heir to the throne. Although she didn't neglect Harry, you could see her very genuine affection and concern for the elder son. Shortly before 9 a.m., Charles and Diana moved into the sitting room with the papers and ordered another pot of coffee. I dashed upstairs with Faye to do the royal beds and bathrooms. Now, this is what I'm talking about when I say that they are a little bit messy, these people. Now, as a rule, the linen in both Charles and Diana's beds were changed every time they stayed. If either was staying during the week, we changed the sheets every 5 days. Now, that rule didn't really hold up when it came to Diana, because oftentimes the white sheets she used were caked in body makeup or full of crumbs and bits of chocolate from her or the boys nibbling things in bed. Yuck. After cleaning the sheets and rearranging the bedroom, she went through to the bathroom and cleaned out the large white bath. And she says that, things were knocked around there, towels all over the floor, whatnot. She makes a note that says that Diana kept her contraceptive pills in a mug by the sink, and she always took them religiously every day, even though there was never any sign that she and the prince spent the night together. After picking up the bath towels that were, all over the floor, she walked into Charles' room and repeated the procedure. On the prince's dressing table was a brown leather folder that opened out as a large photograph frame, and inside there was pictures of William and Harry and Diana and the Queen Mother. A traveling alarm clock stood next to it, as well as a little writing pad on which he left notes to remind himself of things to check the following day. These were to be domestic, things like hunt supper, what time. This is what I'm talking about when I say slovenly. On the top of the pad was a battery-driven shaver, and little specks of beard were scattered over the table. He'd obviously been shaving in bed that morning, as he planned the day ahead. On the other side of his bed was a pile of hardback books, mostly of them barely opened. Shaving in bed? Do people do that? I know I don't have very many men who watch this show, but ladies, does your husband make a habit of shaving in the bed, and would you permit it? I can see now why Diana needs her own bed, but then again, she's over there eating crackers and chocolate. Any bed safe to be in? Okay, well, she introduces us to Teddy, the threadbare companion of Prince Charles. Now, we already knew about Teddy because Harry told us about it and acted like it was really an embarrassing thing of his dad's. I hardly think that it's embarrassing. I mean, I know I made mention of it, Diana and her couch full of stuffed animals, but that seems like she was using those for decorations. Not like this little teddy bear that had some sort of significance to him. Now, what I do think is crazy, I don't think that teddy bear is that crazy. It's unusual, but I don't think it's crazy. But Charles has had this little set of linen hand towels that had been especially made for him by some nuns in America, and they had embroidered on them the Prince of Wales crest. And he insisted on using them, and he would only use them when he went to the bathroom. So, as there was only 4 of them, it meant that all day long, she was having to wash and iron these 4 linen hand towels so that he would have them available to him every time he used the bathroom. Can you imagine all day long having to rewash and re-iron some silly little hand towels? Just can you use a different hand towel? And then, mysteriously, one of them went missing. So then she had only 3 to rely on. And she calls them. She's like, I had to keep on with the ironing of those wretched things. I know, that would have been a real noose around my neck also. She then goes ahead to set the pattern for what it was like for them. So that was her first experience of sort of tidying up after them. But then she moves on to what could she generally expect from a weekend of the royal family coming in. She says that first weekend was to set a pattern for many others during my first 2 years at Highgrove. The prince and princess visited most weekends with or without guests, usually arriving on a Friday evening with the princess and the boys leaving on the Sunday after lunch. Charles usually stayed on Sunday nights and went straight to his engagements the following day. When they were alone as a family, Saturdays were usually devoted to the boys. Charles might take them around the farm with him, or Diana might run them into Tetbury for a look at the shops. They were like most upper-class families, and both parents doted on the boys. It used to make all of us very angry that the prince was always thought by the general public to be a remote and difficult father. William loved to put on old jeans and Wellington boots and follow him around as he chatted the gardeners and decided on what changes he was going to make. Charles was keen to give his children a magical time in the country, and from the early days he tried to encourage William in a love of horses. The Highgrove groom, Marion Cox, would lead him around the grounds on Smokey or Trigger, as Harry, who was still only 14 months old, watched excitedly. But Diana was much less at ease. Remember, she's already made her feelings clear. It's so damp. It always rains. It's a terrible place, especially if you don't like the outdoors. So she always had one excuse or another why she couldn't go out. The book says that Diana, less keen on Highgrove, came in after lunch on Saturday while Charles was outside with the boys. And she came into the kitchen and she said, I've just come through for a cup of tea. And she said, don't worry, I can do it myself. On the tip of her nose hung a small drip of water, which she did not bother to wipe away. I've got a terrible cold, she said weakly. I really cannot face spending the whole day outside. As she waited for the kettle to boil, she sat down at the kitchen chair and chatted. So what do you think then, Wendy? Do you think you can be happy here? I've asked the prince to have a look in at the lodge a bit later so that we can see if there's anything that needs sorting out. Will it be okay to drop in about 6? After making herself a cup of tea, she retreated to her own sitting room. And I think this is strange behavior for the quote-unquote warm mother that she was. Because after making her cup of tea, she went and listened to music, spent the whole afternoon reading magazines, making phone calls to friends, and Charles entertained the boys while she just kind of did her own thing. Now, I'm not opposed to a person going and doing their own thing while another parent, plays with the kids. We can't all be with the kids all the time. It is nice to have a little bit of an off period, but this seems like that was the way. And this was also mentioned in Lady C's book. I never said everything in Lady C's book was an untruth. I believed the majority of it. There was just a few things that I did not think were credible. But she mentioned the same thing, where Diana would go off and be by herself at Highgrove, and, kind of Charles was left with the boys. As the weather deteriorated and dusk fell, Prince, William, and Harry, accompanied by Barbara, came back into the house. The fires, which had been lit in all the main rooms since before lunch, were now blazing, and the boys went into Diana's sitting room to watch television. Charles went into his room to change. The bell sounded again in the kitchen, and James boiled the kettle. It was time for the prince's afternoon cup of Earl Grey tea with a small glass of single malt whiskey. Alongside the cup and saucer, James placed a little glass-stoppered bottle full of whiskey, which Charles himself poured into a cup. There was probably only enough for a triple pub measure, but Charles always drank it, for health reasons, he would say, rather than because he needed something to calm his nerves. Later that day, as I was sitting in the lodge having a surreptitious cigarette, the prince, dressed in smart green trousers, a heavy jumper, and Wellingtons, was standing in the porch, Diana in a puffer jacket and jeans behind him. Hello, Wendy, I just wondered if you have everything you wanted, said Charles kindly. As both of them stepped inside, they removed their boots and walked around the house in their socks. Although it was perfectly natural, I suppose, it did seem funny later on that I had the Prince and Princess of Wales padding around my house without any shoes on. Just as a side note, so it would appear that the royals aren't opposed to being in a house without their shoes on. So Meghan, wanting to make a big deal about the fact that she was so natural that she walked around her house without shoes on, and stodgy old William and Catherine couldn't take it that she had no shoes on. Well, apparently they're okay with it. Charles walked round the lodge, occasionally nodding as Diana talked about what I wanted to do with my new home. Suddenly he stopped by the radiator in the sitting room. Is it damp in here, Wendy? He asked with concern, as if it was one of life's great serious questions. Then getting down on his hands and knees, he tapped along the skirting board near the radiator. Damp, he exclaimed. I knew it. After politely declining the offer of a drink, the prince and princess walked back to the porch. Let's get back for another Mervyn special, said Charles. We're both quite tired and want an early supper. Both laughed as they walked arm in arm up the drive to the main house. I remember thinking how happy and contented they looked that evening, and how different it had been the night before, when Diana had obviously been crying. Maybe there was hope for them both. Maybe the tension that often surfaced between them was no more than a tiff, and they would be genuinely all right together. At least I hoped so. And that is the end of that second chapter. So even though I would love to keep going, because it is a page turner, there's just so many little details that could only be known by somebody who was clearly there on the premises. It just makes this book so interesting. And, I've skipped some of the things. I mean, I don't necessarily care what kind of mouthwash Diana used and things like that, but there's other just little interesting tidbits about life and their schedules and things, but it goes on to be even more interesting than this. I just trust this book more than I trusted the other Diana book, mostly because it is a person who was there on site, actually spent time with them, saw their daily rhythms, was with staff all day long who also saw the daily rhythms. I mean, who more to trust than one of the staff at the house? The housekeeper, no less, And I suppose a person could say, well, she's of a nefarious character. Why would she go and write everything that had happened to her? But, it's her life. Why can't she? And I think she's fairly fair. I mean, she doesn't seem like she's writing this book with the agenda to take either one of them down. I think it's just her telling about her life and existence in a very unusual position. So take what you will with that. If you find it offensive, then I don't know what to say. But I think everybody has the right to tell their own life story. And as it turns out, some people just have very interesting life stories that intersect with names of people that you happen to know. But she should have every right to tell what happened in her life. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me. I look forward to covering this book, and I can't wait to read some more to prep for the next episode. And I cannot say that I have felt that way for a while, at least with Omid Scobie. So Sunday, don't forget, we have another episode of the Mountbattens coming up. So don't forget to enjoy our Sunday treat. And I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye.